Hi, everyone, and welcome to Woolfer TV. I'm Hillary Richard, and today I'm really excited to be interviewing Koa Beck about her new book, White Feminists, From the Suffragettes to Influencers and Who They Leave Behind. Koa Beck was the senior features editor at Marie Claire, executive editor at Vogue, and editor-in-chief at Jezebel, a site we all loved very much. She left Jezebel in 2018 to write a book about fourth wave feminism and became a fellow at the Shorenstein Center at Harvard's Kennedy School to study white feminism. Her book, which I'm going to show you a copy of and you should buy, came out today. It's really fabulous. It's a pretty searing indictment of white feminism, the movement's embrace of individualism, its co-option by capitalism, which, that aspect of it was fascinating to me, and we're gonna talk about that. And particularly its exclusion of women of color and LGBTQ women. It's really well written, it's intensively researched, and it's an important exploration, I think, of what we can do to fight for change. The book, which, as I said, is just coming out today, has already been called Paradigm Shifting, and Koa was just called a visionary by the Boston Globe. So we're super excited to have her here today. Hi, Koa, and thanks for joining us, and welcome.
Hello, and thank you so much, Hillary, for that introduction and for your interest and very thoughtful engagement in my book.
Thank you. Thank you. I mean, it's my pleasure. It's not often I get to interview a visionary, honestly. So the thing about your book, it's excellent. It was eye-opening for me. I think it'll be eye-opening for a lot of people, particularly women of my generation, which is, as you know, what the Woolfer platform really speaks to, women 40 and older. And but I love your writing style. I think being an editor at Jezebel obviously, influenced it, because what I love about it is it's very well researched. It's got a lot of historical information, but it also has a ton of personal anecdotes, and it's written in the contemporary vernacular. So there isn't a dry paragraph in it, and that is a huge feat. So my question, though, I'm wondering, it sounds like I read an interview that you did, I think it was in the Mills College Quarterly, where you talked about, it could have been somewhere else, because I did do a little bit of research, fangirling, where you talked about how excited you were to go to Jezebel because it was the first place you had read about, fat shaming and rape culture and really important feminist concepts. So I'm wondering, what was it in particular that motivated you to leave that pretty fantastic job to write this book, which I'm glad you did, but it's a pretty crowded field, which I think is good. But what do you feel your book specifically adds to the dialogue, or what do you add to the dialogue?
Well, there were two key motivations in me, not only stepping down from my job to write this book, but also effectively retiring from leadership positions in media to be able to do this book. I knew, one, given the scope of what I wanted to do with the book and knowing the amount of research that I would have to do to pull it off,
Right.
is not compatible with an EIC 100-hour-a-week job at a women's publication under a Trump administration. That would not be possible for me. And that was pretty intuitive. I just simply knew I would not have the energy for it. And also, I really wanted to prioritize this book. Having said that, I mean, I've worked in mainstream women's media, my entire adult life, and I'm very aware of like the politics, that come into having roles like that, and being,
Right.
On panels and speaking and being like, the face of like a brand, at any given moment. And given the critiques that I wanted to make about, feminist branding, and also like a lot of how these outlets operate, and media broadly, in terms of like exporting messages about women and conveying to you like what is, a feminist platform and what isn't, I knew that I could not be the face of any, women's outlet and make the arguments that I wanted to make.
That makes sense, because you do critique some pretty high profile people, women, rightly so, in my view. I mean, like the Woody Allen aspect, I suppose you would probably be censored.
Well, and on top of that, I mean, just those roles come with so much in-house politics,
Yeah.
regarding saying certain things, and also like making sure that the brand looks good, at any possible moment. And the thing is that I hope is really, pertinent for people reading the book is like, of these examples and this, white feminist landscape, nobody really comes out looking great. Like,
Yeah.
everybody has trafficked in this at some point in some capacity. So, working for another company that exploits freelancers and doesn't have paid parental leave, and like is very discriminatory in their hiring practices, especially towards like women of color or older women.
Yeah. Why? Yeah.
Yeah. So that was very easy. In terms of the landscape of, gender theory, like feminist books, I think that what makes my book different from at least a lot of what has been published so far, and what I saw as being urgent, is that I see a lot of books in my own just casual reading that make reference to white feminism, or sort of like flippantly like joke about it, but they don't outline what it is. And it's to those authors mission, that's not what their book is about. Their book is usually about like movements led by women of color, or like movements led by like working class women. So like that's not their central thesis. But I really wanted to lay out for the reader not only what this ideology is, but what it was founded on, and the history that really baked the white feminist ideology into contemporary discussions we have now about like the wage gap, and pay discrepancy, and like,
the child care crisis.
Exactly.
Everything.
Yeah.
Well, I found fascinating, really, because I'm educated. And I studied feminist theory. I went to private college. I went to Harvard Law School. I took classes on these issues. But your analysis about the embrace by white feminism of individualism and versus collective action, but particularly the intersection of capitalism and white feminism, was something that is sorely lacking from any educational institution I've ever attended, and I thought was really striking. And I'm curious, I'm wondering what your thoughts are really on whether or not you can ever achieve the goals that you talk about in your book, and that I embrace, and that I think are critical to having a more just and livable society, like eliminating food insecurity, the wage gap, childcare crises, housing crises, clean water. Can you do that, though, without dismantling capitalism? Because it strikes me that those goals and capitalism are diametrically opposed.
I cover many movements and other feminisms that don't operate under a white feminist ideology, that think that that's not possible, and that's why scrutinizing of capitalism is very much foundational to their understanding. In terms of our own country, and what I think as the author, having reviewed all this, and also just my own politics, I think that even as far as capitalism goes, like America is a very extreme example.
Yeah.
And I know that's why, yeah. And especially in my lifetime, conversations and also goals have become so much more extreme under capitalism, and in a very truncated period of time. So I think that I haven't seen it personally.
Yeah.
I kind of put the question back to like a lot of these companies and lawmakers, where it's like, if you can pull this off, like I dare you to show me.
Right. Try it.
Because the like the math, as far as especially women of color and like queer women have been laying out, they say no.
Yeah.
And I think that a good place for us to start in this country specifically is with rethinking our economics, whether it's with capitalism broadly, but even under capitalism, just like straight up, the Federal Bill of Domestic Workers' Rights, like that would really impact the lives of so many women in this country. And our Vice President-elect Kamala Harris, she introduced that bill in 2019. I look forward to seeing, what's going to happen with that in 2021. And,
well, unless we win Georgia, I'm going to tell you nothing.
I know. It's like, I'm doing a lot of press today and I keep sort of like glancing at my
my 20-year-old told me this morning, literally, I had to delete Twitter from my phone because I'm so obsessively, I didn't sleep last night.
Yeah.
Thinking about today and tomorrow. Our, don't think we've had sedition like this since the Civil War, but
yeah.
Well, it's interesting because I think Elizabeth Warren thought there are a lot of things you could do even under a capitalist structure to resolve many of these inequities. But I was really stricken by the distinction that you made between sort of the white feminist movement, this sort of lean in, you can get a seat at the board table, how that really doesn't address the problems of most women. Sure, maybe a tiny percentage of them, but for most women, they're not in the boardroom unless they're cleaning that shit at night or, serving some coffee during the day. And so I really, it made me think quite a lot about whether or not any equity can be achieved under our present system. I'd have to say I'd be shocked, frankly.
And that's a good thing that's where you got to.
Yes, it's a very good thing. It's a very good thing. Now, you had mentioned earlier that white feminism uses ageism to further invisibilize older women. And, I think this is a really important point for our demographic. And I'm curious, can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I saw you hold up the galley, and I'm thinking that in that version that went out, there's like some additions I made about ageism that I don't think are quite in your version, but they're in the final.
Okay, good. I'm gonna have to buy that now.
Basically, when the white feminist ideology was being solidified by the middle to upper class white suffragettes in the United States, they, in sort of a massive PR campaign, they homogenized in-house in their suffrage groups who a suffragette was. And it was very pointed on their part that the suffragette was always young. And, she was always white. She was always, very thin and able-bodied, and she was, middle to upper class or aspiring to be middle to upper class. She always, was distinctly heterosexual. She always wanted to be a wife and a mother. Early depictions of suffrage always show like a young woman like sheltering a baby, they. But anyway, that's all to say that youth has always been a big part of the ideology and how white feminist messaging is both propagated, but also in terms of who they get you to think about. So they inherit a lot from like white supremacy and also just generally like paternalism in terms of getting you to think about like your daughter, or really relying on the sort of youth-centric culture that already exists, especially for women. And conversely, when suffrage groups in-house were designing who a suffragette was in order to gain like attention and support of suffrage, they were also very particular in who they chose to represent people who are anti-suffrage. And that person was always older.
Oh my God.
Yep, they were generally fat. And it was to really, use those very ageist, like fat shaming tactics to basically milk support for young white middle class women.
How is it even possible that we're basically in the same place in terms of idealizing that type of female today that we were hundreds of years ago? Like, how is that? It's inconceivable to me.
I think it comes down to the fact that white feminism as a practice has always partnered with consumerism in everything that they have done. And this was true, even in the beginning of organized, women's rights in this movement. I point out in the book, in my research, that suffragettes declared Macy's the headquarters for suffrage.
Oh my God.
And designed like an official suffrage outfit that was in all these like window displays, and they partnered with retailers to make like votes for women sashes and like hats and pins and luggage tags and cups and playing cards. And like youth is a very big part of marketing, straight up. Like that is a extension in the same way that like sex is a very big part of marketing.
Yeah.
So I think that white feminism as an ideology and a practice just usurped that and continues to today. I mean, especially like I think of, I've had to cover all kinds of like women's empowerment conferences through my career, and I've had to go to all these panels, and it's like, the advertisements that I am sent, the engagement that always tries to like get my attention. It's always younger women who are like under 35, and they're holding a smartphone, and like they, have very dewy skin. And then, there might be like one like over 50 woman who's there, but like she's invisible too in terms of like her needs as a woman in this country, her healthcare, like postmenopausal healthcare initiatives that like she needs, anything to do with like arthritis, that I get into in my book, like how sexist the healthcare industry is, and her needs as a woman who is not young are not centralized in white feminism at all.
Yeah, I mean, you made me relook at history, I think, in a really important way. And I do think that your book is going to be, required reading. I hope so. I will tell you that it's, I hope it's the first step in a path to go somewhere else, which is what I really wanted to talk to you about also, because I'm on boards, I'm part of organizations that have had to do anti-bias training in the wake of the George Floyd murder, and then the riots and what have you, not riots, but the protests and the disruptions. And you talk, it's interesting because you talk about this towards the end. And the question that white women always seem to have is, what can we do? Like, how do we change this? What's our path going forward? Like, now that we understand in some more meaningful way how we've contributed, what we haven't done right, like, what do we do? And, I know you say in your book that there isn't, reading this book, the person reading this book isn't going to be able to solve the problem, that we have to, make associations with groups and other women, and and look towards collective action, look towards working on issues that are going to help women across the board identify issues as women issues when they truly are, like food insecurity and poverty, because they affect women disproportionately, particularly women of color. But what can you talk to us about going forward, about tangible, meaningful things going forward? Because obviously we're in a big shitty mess, and what do we do about it?
I in the part of the book that you're citing, I lay out sort of a blueprint. I guess that's what the Boston Globe called it. And to course correct for white feminism. And the way forward is not through these individualized actions. And I understand what you mean when, and I talk about this in the book, when, so many women ask me at speaking engagements, what can I do? And, in terms of you standing there asking me that question, I don't really think there's a lot.
Oh no. Sydney, have we lost Koa? Hold tight, everybody. Hi.
I got
you for a minute there.
Sorry about that.
You were just saying that we, one of us standing there individually at a reading or
Yeah,
something. Much for us.
I think that a good lie that white feminism has been very successful in exporting across generations is that change begins and ends with you, and that you as the individual woman need to be the change in the room. And I actually
Yep.
don't necessarily think that's true, especially looking at the scope of history. You need to think about building resistance movements with other women. If you're, in a white collar workspace or even a working class workspace, you need to organize a union with other women. If you're in a situation professionally where you are experiencing, pay discrimination or age discrimination, or, are fired because you're pregnant, chances are you are not the only woman that has happened to in that professional environment. That is probably a pattern that they have been using for a while, and you need to find and work with these other women to combat these systemic forces. And I think that can take, the shape of so many different things depending on where you are in the country and what your life looks like and who is available to you. I this summer was very impressed with Wall of Moms in Seattle.
Yeah.
I thought that was amazing.
I thought that was amazing. I bought a yellow t-shirt just hoping it would come here.
Yeah, and I, honestly, especially in my lifetime, but even in thinking about the research I did for this book, white women getting up, like middle class, like suburban white women walking the streets and putting themselves in front of police. I have never seen that personally in this country.
I haven't either.
Or even in my research for this book, I have not seen that. So I think they're a good example of what can happen when you identify a problem and then it's systemic, and then you partner with other women to think about these solutions. And there are examples of that. Like, even if you look at like Women's March, for instance, Women's March has been critiqued a lot since its inception. And I get into that in the book. But this idea that all of these women across the country would march to oppose this presidency is incredibly powerful, and I don't think should be undervalued as a strategy.
Yeah, and many of us with kids and husbands in tow, and
yeah, I think that removing the individual responsibility from these conversations is a good place to step away from white feminism. You need to think as a group.
That's really interesting. It's so difficult. You did identify this when you were talking about this in your book, in terms of workplace discrimination, which is an area that I practiced in for the first decade or so of my career. You did make reference to the idea that when you raise these issues, you often lose your job. Even if you're right, even if you have a good lawyer, chances are you're not going to be able to stay, because then they're just going to figure out a way to get rid of you or make your life so impossible that you can't stay. So it is really a smart idea to think about trying to find, there's power in numbers. And in terms of that, I've been thinking about that now as we talk. It's very kind of individualistic to sue, take a settlement, be bound by a settlement agreement. I mean, we saw this with Weinstein. We've seen this over and over again, where then you can't talk and then somebody else gets abused. And kudos to the women who said, fuck this, I'm going to talk anyway, and risk getting sued and stand up for other women. And is there any other sort of more, any other avenues that you think that we should be pursuing? I mean, I know obviously politics is one. It's important who we elect to office. I feel like as citizens, and in terms of caring about women of color, queer women, we should all be trying to vote into office across the country, people who are, going to protect their rights as opposed to stifle them,
I think also education is very important in terms of public school education. Like, there's been so much data that's come out in my lifetime specifically about how basically public schools are segregated again, and they're segregated, across class, which also has like a huge racialized component to that. But what that means is that you have these like really, really insulated white suburbs that are keeping themselves white suburbs and actively want to stay white suburbs. And I did address at some point in the book in terms of like how white feminism, and to that extent, like white supremacy often has operated in real time, is women are often on the ground, advocating for these things with like bake sales and PTA meetings and newsletters. And like women are a very, very instrumental part of activist labor, really across any ideology. They're very essential. And the roles that women have traditionally had, if we're thinking in terms of like being a mother or being a wife, like their ability to, approach others and like convey the urgency about certain things has been very, very historically powerful. So I think that if you, are in one of these suburbs that I'm talking about, where there's only like 2 Black kids and, the school likes that, I would consider, what you can do from the inside, whether it's like PTA stuff that you do or any sort of volunteer, if you're involved with your, children's academic life or after school sports, see what you can do to disrupt that with other women, because this ability to like keep brown kids out has been very, very pervasive in this country, and it's having really long-standing effects in terms of like education, but also just, to be honest, like the insulation of these white children, honestly, too, that, they are growing up really thinking that they're entitled to everything, and that they shouldn't have to think, across race or class, literally in their classrooms, but also in the communities around them, in their neighborhoods and things like that. And that's very damaging.
It is, and I think it also influences, I think, we're privileged to live in New York City, and you can't, go a second without seeing people from all different walks of life. And I mean, depending on what neighborhood you live in, I suppose, because New York is also segregated,
Yes.
But certainly I grew up on the Upper West Side before it was safe to live on the Upper West Side. And, it was the neighborhood thing where everyone just sort of roamed around without parental supervision and hung out. And, you interacted with people of all different races. And I think when you aren't interacting with people who are different other than you, then you see them as other. And, my kids have grown up, I think, in a very different way. For them, it's perfectly normal that you would immediately use the preferred gender pronoun. If somebody changes their name, you don't use their dead name. Gender is fluid, sexuality is fluid. These are concepts that to them are just second nature. Like they don't even think twice about it. But they live, in New York City. They don't live in Long Island, for example. And I think once you are looking at people through that lens, and you just think, of course, like of course, queer people should marry. Why not? I mean, to the extent anyone thinks marriage is a good idea, anyone should be able to have at it. So I agree with you on that front. One of the things you mentioned was that we should be holding women accountable for abuse. And are you talking about instances like female actresses who work for Woody Allen and don't like stand up and say this is wrong or walk out? Or is it, it's obviously broader than that. I'm wondering if you give a couple of
I think of it more broadly than that. I think in terms of the women specifically who have enacted abuses, whether it's like on a corporate scale or on a one-to-one scale. And a lot of their abuses have the capacity to not be seen, as demeaning or as grave because they are women. And that includes, sexual predation as well. And this sort of, it's insulation, but also it's like a tactic of white feminism that you can take up all these exploitative, abusive, entitled psychologically manipulative tactics to be this extremely powerful patriarch and then not be held accountable for abusing people, whether it's financially or physically or emotionally. And I have heard, like, throughout my career specifically, when I've either, you know, challenged someone on that in an interview or challenged, you know, in a professional setting, the comeback is always like, but I'm just doing what men do. Like, why am I being persecuted? And it's like, because what men do is bad.
It's wrong. Yeah. Yeah.
And that's that's what patriarchy is. But I think white feminism has been very successful at taking patriarchal principles and exporting them directly to women, and with, you know, a lot of, like, in real time, like, gains, you know, like money, power,
Yeah, no
titles,
question.
influence. Like, the accolades are very real.
No, there's no question. I mean, I've benefited from behaving like a man financially, you know, and obviously, as your book makes clear, to succeed in business, I had to employ, you know, women of color to help me raise my children.
Mhm.
And, you know, I think it's really important that we all think about this in a really concrete and meaningful way. And your book does that. And I'm just really grateful. And I'm so grateful that you came on to talk to us about it today. What's next for you, Koa Beck?
In what capacity? Like,
In your
literally
life?
or broadly?
Are you
Um,
working on something else, or are you just gonna do a ton of press on this? Because I think this book is gonna be big, and I really I look forward to that for you.
Oh, thank you. Well, yes, I have a lot of press commitments for white feminism, which I'm really excited about, especially because I've been working on this book for a really long time. And it's a very, I think, especially given my temperament, I'm a very introverted person. I like to read all the time.
Oh, that's
I,
interesting. I wouldn't have guessed.
oh, yes, I'm a very, very big introvert. That's like, as like a white collar person who, you know, has like a home and clean water, like, in some ways, quarantine is kind of made for me. um, but having said that, you know, like, I lived in New York for 10 years, and right before COVID happened, actually, my wife and I moved to LA, which is actually where I grew up, because my father is in declining health. And so
Um,
we moved home to take care of him.
mhm.
So, like, for my temperament, COVID is great, but I'm also, you know, really worried about my dad all the time and making sure he's
Yeah,
safe, and that, like, you know, he's washing his hands, and that, like,
right.
nobody's coming into the house, because he's,
Yeah.
you know, compromised for sure.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Um, but that's all to say that I've worked on this for such a long time by myself, and it's a very surreal feeling, especially as a writer, you know, to have this, like, living and breathing document that's
I
on your
bet.
computer for so long with all these different notes, and then you turn around and it's like on a board behind you.
Like,
and
it's
like
like birthing a child and have them become a teenager.
and like everybody has an opinion on it, and
Yeah.
like wants to talk to you about it, which is great. So yes, I have a lot of press that I'm doing that I'm really excited to do, and then I have some other books that I want to write too, but that's very TBD. I need
That's
to
fantastic.
hear more about, you know, if that's possible and if people want to work with me on this.
Oh, I'm sure they will. I think, you know, having three daughters right now, 27, 20, and 15, I really do feel like, you know, the youth is going to save us from ourselves. And I'm sure they're going to do that in part by reading your book. So yay to you. I know my girls are going to do it. So um, take a well-deserved rest, and I'm hoping that the book does terrifically, and I'm encouraging everyone who's listening to order it particularly from your independent bookstore. And on that note, Koa, thank you so much, and good luck to you and your dad. And thanks for
Oh,
joining.
thank you so much. And thank you, Hillary, again, for so thoughtfully engaging with the book. It really means a
Oh,
lot to me.
thank you. Thanks, Koa.